Hey everyone, so I've been wanting to work on the curb appeal of my home for a long time, and I have a few projects lined up. But in this episode, I'll show you how I took my front porch ceiling from this to this. And then I'll share with you the lessons I learned along the way and what I'd do differently if I had to do it again. So I did do this project in my backyard a couple years ago to make sure that I'd like it, and I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. But unfortunately, it was a lot harder than I remembered. So I expected to be able to do the front porch in one day, and it took two. In terms of hand tools, I ended up using a hammer, a screwdriver, a box cutter, this small pry bar, a scraper/putty knife, and a tape measure. And some other random bits, gloves, rags, and a tarp, which were all used in the staining process. And of course, a ladder. In terms of power tools, I used a driver and a jigsaw, and a table and a miter saw. The first step was to measure out the ceiling, which in my case was about 4.5 feet by 22 feet, or nearly 100 square feet. At the hardware store, I saw they sold 6-inch pine tongue and groove boards, but the actual visible area was closer to 5 inches, and it came in lengths from 8 to 16 feet. So before buying the wood, I worked out on some graph paper a layout that would keep seams a decent distance apart, say at least 2 feet, while being efficient with the wood. I also didn't want a lot of seams right over the door if I could help it, which called for 7 of the 8 foot, 7 of the 16, and 6 of the 12-foot boards. At the store, I was just focused on finding relatively clean, unbroken pieces of wood, so I didn't even think to check for any warping, but I'd recommend it. You can do this by staring down the length of the board and seeing if it looks straight. I really liked the stain color as shown on the label, but when I used it on the wood, it only turned orange. So I put 2 coats of that in an attempt to make it darker and richer, followed by a coat of gunstock, which really darkened the boards a lot. I think if I hadn't put the golden oak on first, the gunstock would have really soaked in and made the wood much darker than I wanted. So I laid out a tarp on my front porch and stained all the wood there at once, but I actually wouldn't recommend this. 1, it was pretty crowded, and 2, I couldn't see how the colors were taking very easily. I think it's much better to do a few at a time, all easily in sight, so you can vary the amount of stain and how long you let it sit there to achieve consistent colors. Since I didn't do this, a few of the longer boards got really dark, and I ended up having to buy 6 new 8-foot boards to take their place. But we were able to save one thanks to the valiant efforts of my sister and her boyfriend with the sander and scrapers. I tried on another one later, but it was still too dark, so I recommend just replacing them. And you can't tell from most angles, but that sanded board has a slightly different sheen than the rest of them. I may try and even that out with some kind of clear coat later. I know there is a wood conditioner product you can apply to help the stain process, but it had gone okay when I did my back porch, so I decided to go without it again. I'd also recommend taking this time to look closely at your boards for any defects, if you didn't do that at the store already. We didn't see it until we had already nailed it into position, but one of the boards was missing the bevel for about 2 feet at the end. In this case, the site prep was pretty simple. First, I removed my porch light. If you have a nighttime motion detector like I do, you might have the option of putting it in test mode so you can turn it on at the switch. Then turn off the breakers until you see the lights go off. Once that's done, you can proceed with taking it down, undoing the neutral, live, and ground wires, and then recap the wires before turning the breaker back on if other lights you need are on that circuit. Using a razor blade, I cut through 100 years of paint along both sides of the trim, then used a hammer and scraper to pry it out. I was initially going to try and save this trim, but it broke a few times, and cleaning them up would have taken ages. I then used the scraper to take off any caulk and ridges of paint that might get in the way with the new boards, and pulled the last few nails with a hammer. According to my planned out pattern, the first board was a 16-footer. We ripped off the tongue so that side could go along the door wall. We also used a miter saw to ensure the end that would match up with another board was straight and square. To make our lives a bit easier, we started some nails while I was on the ground, within 2 inches of each end, and about every 2 feet, using the measuring tape as a guide. When positioning these nails, I'd recommend avoiding any knots. If the 2-foot line ends up being right on a knot, I'll just move the nail a couple inches to avoid it. It's just a lot harder to get through them. And we use these 62-inch electro-galvanized finish nails. Then we put the groove side out because I think that's easier, especially at the end, to add new boards tongue first. More on this later. This project is quite humbling in a way because hammering overhead makes you feel like you've never swung a hammer before in your life. What I found helped was holding the hammer a lot higher up on the handle than I normally would. We also didn't jam the board hard up against the side to leave some room for expansion and contraction. Any small gap here will be hidden by the trim later anyway. While we drove these nails in all the way, we later learned to leave them a bit proud in case we had to remove or reposition the board for some reason. I think it also makes putting in the next board a bit easier since the nailed board isn't so tight against the ceiling. Once the next row was installed, then we'd drive all the nails in the previous row. If you do have to remove a nail, protect your boards with a piece of scrap. One of the frustrations we encountered was a really curved 16-foot long board. No matter how much we tried to hammer it in position, it just bounced back. I was later able to cut this board into shorter sections, which worked really well. When hammering these boards into place, make sure to use a scrap piece of the same type of wood so you're not hitting your good pieces directly with the hammer. If you're doing this with help, it's of course much easier. I continued this the next day on my own, so made up these little screw-in retainers with a bit of cam action on them to help press the boards into position. It worked about half the time. For the light fixture, I simply held up the boards and marked the location of the hole. Since the light will cover this anyway, it doesn't matter if it's perfect, but it's still nice to do reasonably well. The hole should be bigger than the attachment plate inside, but smaller than the footprint of the fixture. The last row of wood ended up only being about 1 inch wide. As you can see, I can't fit a 1 inch wide piece in because of the tongue, so I used the table saw to cut at a 30-degree angle off the back to let it get into position. Now you can see, with some wiggling, they fitted nicely. I didn't bother with nails here because these pieces were hard to get out anyway, and the trim would secure them really well. In hindsight, I'd probably just use all 8-foot boards because they're easier to transport, easier to stain, and easier to put into position. I don't think the seams are a big deal. The 16-foot boards were also more expensive per foot anyway. My trim was 3/4 inch quarter round, and the 8-foot PVC versions seemed like the best deal at the store. I started off cutting 45-degree angles into the 4 pieces that would meet in corners. To cut it correctly, I held the trim in the miter saw in the same orientation it would be once installed. So that'll work. Then I installed the 2 8-foot lengths first along the long side. For the piece between those, I simply held up another and marked the length and cut it a bit longer just to make sure. As I'm sure you know, it's always easier to move a little bit by bit if it's still too long. Here, I left it long enough to stay up just by friction, and it pushed down nicely into position. Finally, I measured the short side pieces, since I couldn't hold them up to mark them, and purposely cut them a bit long so I could fine-tune the fit. On one end, I used the box cutter to whittle away some material so it fit more snugly into the corner. With a nail every foot or two, these worked great. Last but not least, I had to reinstall the light. Again, I turned off the breaker, then started by attaching the ground wire, followed by the neutral and live wires. Then I simply reassembled it. And here are the results. So overall, the wood for this project cost about $300, but because of the mishap with the stains, I ended up spending about $50 more. The nails were about $8, the trim another $40, and while I had the stain on hand already, it's about $13 for a quart of that. So this project should have cost me about $360, but ended up costing me just over $400. So if you're thinking of doing something similar, I hope this video has been helpful. And if you stick around, I should have some other projects coming up, like the front door and some stone veneer. So I'll just see you next time. Hey, I'm Dan, and my mom and I bought some land out in the countryside to build a house. And to help with that, we thought we should have a trailer. So why not renovate a 1949 Spartan Manor? So if you want to see how these go, plus some other random DIY stuff, subscribe and follow along.